Hello, this film is for family carers who have a relative with a learning disability, autism, or both. The film covers the key areas of planning for your relative's future when you're no longer around. Much of the content has been informed by the wonderfully useful Thinking Ahead Planning Guide for Families, written by Christine Towers from Together Matters. The guide was the result of conversations with people with learning disabilities and their families about what mattered to them when thinking about the future. There is also information about other areas which we, the Family Carer Support Service, feel is important for you to know about as a result of our own conversations with family carers. Some of the areas that we cover are hard for people to talk about as they involve thinking about death and dying, but we hope that this film provides a useful introduction to give you the confidence to start planning for your futures together.
I've made a will which includes my relative as a beneficiary. How can I make sure their inheritance doesn't affect their entitlement to benefits and social care?
So, the best way to ensure that any money, property, or investment remains available to your relative without it affecting their benefits and social care is to put it into a special trust. Any money acquired over £6,000 can start affecting your relative's entitlement to means-tested benefits, and anything over £16,000 may cause some of your relative's benefits to completely stop. With regards to adult social care funded support, the current upper limit for capital, before an individual is deemed able to afford the full cost of their care and support, is £23,250. But as with anything money related, please check this information is still up to date before making any decisions relating to wills and trusts.
There are two kinds of trust, a discretionary trust and a disabled person's trust. A disabled person's trust is considered more restrictive, so people tend to opt for a discretionary trust. A discretionary trust involves the legal transfer of assets to trustees who then have the decision as to how to spend these assets. A discretionary trust requires you to name more than one person who would benefit from the trust, so that your relative is not seen as the only beneficiary. You would also write a letter of wishes saying how you would like the money to be shared out, and the trustees will use this to decide which of the beneficiaries receives help from the trust. So it's important to choose trustees whom you believe will respect your wishes. The trust can pay for things that your relative otherwise wouldn't be able to afford, and that the local authority wouldn't usually pay for, such as holidays, new shoes, equipment, or additional support. If you're thinking about leaving a property to your relative, then a discretionary trust can be used to own, manage, and look after that property. Whether you're thinking about leaving money or property, it's really important to seek proper legal advice before making any decisions.
Trusts sound complicated. How should I choose a solicitor?
When I was doing research for the Thinking Ahead guide, I heard from some families who felt they'd spent money on poor legal advice. It's therefore advisable to use a specialist solicitor when setting up a trust, as not all solicitors will have detailed knowledge about the process. Ask the solicitor whether they're familiar with preparing wills and discretionary trusts that aim to benefit a person with a learning disability. You could ask them their fee for carrying out the work, and if the solicitor is familiar with this kind of work, then they should be able to give you a quote there and then. If they're hesitant, it might indicate that they're not experienced enough in this area and you should look for someone else.
MENCAP suggests asking the following questions. What qualifications do you have? What experience do you have in this area? Have you acted for parents or family carers of a person with a learning disability before? Have you set up a trust for the benefit of a person with a learning disability? And you can also contact MENCAP directly for that up-to-date list of specialist legal professionals.
I'm worried about what's going to happen to my relative when I'm no longer around. How can I make sure they're kept safe and are properly supported in the future when I'm not there to keep an eye on things?
Whilst you cannot control the future, you can at least plan for it. And that's the best thing that you can do for your relative. Sometimes families don't know where to start, so I often suggest that a good way of getting the ball rolling is to create an emergency plan in case you're suddenly faced with a situation such as needing to go into hospital. In an emergency plan, you can look at what would work well for your relative in terms of who might be able to help out, what kinds of support they would need, and the best ways of reassuring them if they were feeling anxious. All of these steps can help to prevent an emergency from turning into a crisis. Emergency plans are very important if your relative lives at home with you, but also if they live more independently and rely on you as part of their support network. Ask your relative's social worker about how they coordinate emergency planning in your area, and you could use the guidance and template in the Thinking Ahead guide to begin a plan now. Families often say that once they've started working on an emergency plan, they find it much easier to start thinking about the longer term future.
As Christine has already said, an emergency plan is one of the best things you can do for your relative. If your relative has a care and support plan from the local authority, this should also indicate what contingencies are in place in the event of a sudden change or emergency. The plan must be reviewed annually or sooner if your relative's needs change. It's also worth noting that a local authority does not have to meet a need, even when that need is eligible for local authority support if a carer is willing and able to meet it. So it's important that all of your relatives' needs are recorded in their care and support plan, because should something happen to you, the local authority has a legal obligation to meet your relatives' eligible needs without delay, so make sure the plan is up to date. It's also important that family carers think about their own needs as carers and how these needs might change over time. For information on how to get support for you and your relative from your local authority, please see our 5 key messages about the Care Act film.
We are frequently contacted by siblings of a person with a learning disability after their parent has died. At a time when they are grieving, they find themselves having to re-establish their relationship with their sibling. If they decide to take on some or all of the caring responsibilities that their parents had, they often have to contend with the maze that is social care and health services for the first time, which is a pretty daunting task at an already difficult time. It's important to involve siblings in conversations about future planning. Excluding siblings from the conversations because you want them to get on with their own lives is likely to make things harder for them in the future. Siblings may not want to take over the role of their parents, preferring to maintain their existing relationship with their sibling, which is up to them. The Care Act makes very clear the importance of establishing what a carer is willing and able to do for their relative, and that includes future carers such as siblings. On the other hand, siblings may want to take on more of the responsibilities and would rather have the opportunity to prepare for that now. Either way, it's important to ask them how much they want to be involved and to begin having these conversations now. Don't leave out the person with the learning disability either, as they may have very different ideas about their own future compared to their brothers and sisters. There is a fantastic charity called SIBS, which is the only UK charity completely dedicated to siblings of a person with a learning disability and/or autism. There are lots of useful resources on their website, and they host support groups locally throughout the UK.
A circle of support is a great way for your relative, as well as any other family members and friends, to be included in the planning. A circle of support is simply a group of people who all have a commitment to a person and are keen to help them have a good life and stay safe and well. Many circles of support meet up to help someone with a learning disability to plan things in their lives. This might be social activities, getting a job, or moving into their own home. The ideas about planning in a person-centred way that can be found in the Thinking Ahead guide can help members of a circle of support to ask questions and gather information that help people to have a better and safer future. There is also a guide called I'm Thinking Ahead, written to help people with learning disabilities be part of conversations about their future. When I was doing research for the Thinking Ahead planning guide, people with learning disabilities told us they wanted to know there would be other people around for them when their parents pass away. So a circle of support can be a really good way of making sure other people know your relative and care about what happens in their life. They do take a bit of energy to get set up, but they are usually well worth it.
I like the sound of a circle of support, but I don't think I have anyone to ask. Do you have any advice for this?
Families are often surprised at how many people are already involved in their relative's life that could be invited to become part of the circle of support. This may be relatives outside of the immediate family, family friends or neighbours. If possible, it's good to involve at least some people who are from the same generation as the person themselves, as they often bring different ideas and will be around to keep an eye on things in years to come. You could think about nieces and nephews or friends of siblings. However, some families feel very much alone and it can be hard to get a circle together. I sometimes suggest to families in this situation that they just aim to get another person interested in helping them to plan. This might be someone who's been paid to support their relative who seems to have a good relationship with them, or it could be another parent they know or a neighbour. The circle could grow from there over time, but even if it stays small, it doesn't matter. It helps to have another person to share ideas with. One family I knew said they felt very isolated and didn't feel a circle of support for their daughter was a possibility. They mentioned that their daughter walked around their street and neighbours were used to seeing her doing this. So I suggested trying to build some connections with a neighbour who seemed understanding of their daughter. This led to a neighbour coming around for coffee and getting to know their daughter gradually over time.
We also hear that families don't want to burden other people, so they're too nervous to ask. Just remember, while someone saying no can be disappointing, this is really the worst that could happen. And people will provide the amount of support that they feel comfortable with, even if that is just popping in on someone once a week for a cup of tea. Try not to view it as a burden. Many people would feel honoured to become part of someone's circle of support, so don't be afraid to ask.
I'm undecided about whether to speak about death or sickness to my relative. I'm not sure whether they'll understand what I'm saying, and if they do, I'm worried that it will upset them too much. Can you give me any advice on this?
Illness, dying and deaths are topics of conversations that are treated differently on an individual level and on a cultural one. In Ireland, we tend to have quite an open culture around death and many sayings around it. My personal favourite is "May you be in heaven half an hour before the devil knows you're dead." Death is one of the very few certainties in life and something that each of us will experience. Yet it's common for people to feel so uncomfortable thinking about death that they avoid speaking about it. When you couple these feelings of discomfort with the idea of speaking about it to a person with a learning disability, it can feel even more uncomfortable. When there are numerous people involved in supporting a person with a learning disability, it's not uncommon to have conflicting views about whether or not to tell a person that a relative is sick or dying, or even that the person themselves is terminally ill. People worry that the person won't be able to understand death because it's an abstract concept, or they think it will be too upsetting for the person to process. It is important to take into consideration the person's disability and to pitch the information at the right level and time. But not talking about something does not mean that it won't happen. Irene Tuffrey has been doing great work in this area for many years, and I recommend visiting her website, Breaking Bad News. You'll find a range of resources for families, support workers, and other professionals about how to break bad news to people with a learning disability, and that's at any level. The resources are full of useful tips and practical information. Macmillan has a range of easy-read guides to support people with learning disabilities to understand about cancer. These are on the Macmillan website. Cruse Bereavement is also a brilliant national charity offering support, advice and information to people who have been affected by death. I appreciate that it may feel like you're protecting a person by not talking to them about these things, but there is a dignity in being told and being able to grieve. You may want to seek input from a support worker or another practitioner. It's important to appreciate that they will have their own understanding and way of dealing with death, which may not be the same as your own.
How can I make sure that my relative gets the kind of funeral that I think they would want, even if I'm no longer around?
So the best way to make sure that your relative has the funeral that they want is firstly to ask them what they'd like, if possible, and secondly to plan for it. Depending on how old your relative is, it might be appropriate to start having conversations with them now about what they would like. If there is no funeral plan in place, it falls to those closest to your relative, such as support staff or surviving family, to make the arrangements at the time. Some of HFT's support staff and managers have arranged some really personal funerals for the people that we support because they've known them for years. But if there are things that are especially important to you or your relative, then it's important to get those ideas down on paper and to make sure that someone else is aware of them. If you have the resources, a prepaid funeral plan allows you to arrange and pay for the funeral in advance, and most funeral directors offer this service. If you are passing property onto your relative through a trust but don't have the funds available now to prepay for a funeral, you can request in your letter of wishes that money is set aside to pay for your relative's funeral. In some circumstances, it might be possible for the person with a learning disability to start putting some money aside for this purpose too. If an individual passes away without any money, then the responsibility for the funeral arrangements goes to the next of kin or close friends. There is some government help if the person paying for the funeral is on benefits, but unless they have a good reason not to, then they will be expected to pay. If there's space, people of faith may choose to be buried in their faith churchyard, in which case the church may help towards the funeral costs. In the event that someone dies and there are no surviving friends or family, then the local authority has a legal duty under the Public Health Act 1984 to arrange a cremation or a burial if there are known religious reasons. But this won't include a funeral or a headstone. In some circumstances, there are trusts available which will cover the cost of a funeral or perhaps pay for the headstone for a person with a learning disability. British Gas, for example, has a trust available to pay for funeral expenses. However, this really does depend on the circumstances and what's available in your local area. So if there are certain things that are important to your relative, it's best to make provisions in advance where you can.
If there's one piece of advice you would give to families, what would it be?
You could start with an emergency plan and then look through the Thinking Ahead guide and consider what stage you're at and where you're comfortable starting. Some families may want to start with a trust or a will, whereas others might want to look at housing and support. It's all in the guide. If you're looking to leave money or property to your relative, don't just set up a trust. Go to a specialist solicitor and choose person-centred trustees. That's really important. The best advice I can give you is to begin conversations with your relative and people who know them and get as much written down as possible.
Yes, so I would say start early. It's never too early to start planning for the future, and it will take a huge load off your mind once you start. Don't be scared to involve support staff, as well as other family and friends, as they're key to this process. And ask social services to support the planning process too if you wish. They have a duty to signpost you to advice and information at the very least, but there's no reason why they can't be more actively involved in the process if you think it would help.
For lots of people, the idea of speaking about things like illness, death and money is often more uncomfortable than the reality of having those conversations. They are difficult topics, so try to prepare yourself for them emotionally. Think about the best way and place to approach the topic for your family and friends. There's likely to be a lot of information that you need to plan and discuss. Try to separate the issues or topics and perhaps even have a checklist with you during the conversation. This will be particularly useful if you're in a meeting with professionals and there's a time limit on the meeting. If you're worried, read the Thinking Ahead guide or give us a call. The free phone number for the Family Care Support Service is 0808 801 0448. For a list of the organisations and resources that we've referenced in this film, please visit our website.
With thanks to the East Somerset Friends Group for their support, which made this film possible.